Well, it's been a heck of a journey for me. When you look at nearly 7 years ago, a little over that, when you kind of come from the real world to run for an office like Senate, it's always a pleasure for me in growing my business, being involved in politics, of being maybe underestimated and plowing through with hard work and a great business plan, and when the results are pleasing. And I still refer to the 37 years I did that running a business, and I think the analog between it and getting involved in politics and government has got a lot of similarities. So this being the fourth rodeo, none of them are the same. They each got their own challenges, but I think here, when I took the collective experience of being on a school board while I was still running a business, 3 years in the state legislature, 6 years on a stage like being in the U.S. Senate, where it's almost impossible to get much done due to the divided nature of it. And remember, you got to get 60 senators agreeing to whatever you get done. And we did that with a great team at a level that puts us at the top of that freshman class. And in areas like healthcare, education, agriculture, better than the Republican senators that have been there for decades. So that's a tribute, in my mind, to having great people around you. So why do you leave the U.S. Senate? Is because being an entrepreneur, I think there's more potential back here at home. I think the biggest issue D.C. is going to deal with, regardless of the outcome of the election, is the fact that they can't run the place functionally and financially responsibly. And for as much as I've talked about that and been the loudest voice on it and true problem solving out there, I didn't see that being to where you could accomplish much, and I would have never reneged on spending more than 2 terms there. So that's the context for me that says this is a platter of opportunity when you come back to a state that's been run pretty well. 20 years ago, a guy named Mitch Daniels had to come along to fix a state that was not the same place politically it is now, but more importantly, it was in the red financially. And that was a fix-up project. And I think that got handed over to good stewardship. Doesn't mean, though, that you can't do better, that maybe you plateau after you've been holding the reins for a good amount of time. So this race was based upon my running on kitchen table issues that I had a lot of luck at in my current job, soon to be prior, and getting along with a legislature that I served at. Most of the committee heads and folks running it are still the same. I view that as something that would be a lost opportunity if we don't make real progress. And again, looking across the aisle as well, because I've been the loudest voice on health care reform. That's generally the issue that the other side of the aisle claims to be most interested in. I think that's a golden opportunity when we pay more than almost all states do for it, and we have poor outcomes. K through 12 being half our budget, post-secondary another 15%, workforce education, very important. And those two lead issues, along with, I've talked about childcare, rural broadband, affordable housing, and now where you'd never expect it in a state that's abundantly blessed with annual rainfall and good water resources, that's an issue going forward. Not to mention, every larger business seems to need a ton of juice or electricity, which is not easy to put together. So those are some challenges that if we get it right here, that differentiates us among the other 49 states. And so I view it entrepreneurially. It'll be done with fiscal responsibility. That's the easiest thing from where I come from, both in running a business and what I've been talking about out in D.C. So that kind of sets the stage for any questions you might have. Politically, All I can tell you is maybe now you're respected because you know how to get involved in complicated political navigations. None of them easy. All have ups and downs, but never would have taken the first step 7 years ago if I didn't feel good about the outcome. And the 3 rodeos since then, including the one that was forecast to be very tight, I never felt it was going to be, but I also acknowledge that there are ebbs and flows, and we fought through them. So I think that part is something that we lay aside, and I'm going to be focusing on what I bring to the table: experience, problem solving, and making Hoosiers' lives better across the board.
Senator or governor-elect, what this kind of margin,
Yeah.
a race that some people thought had been tightening, when you have this kind of margin in victory, do you feel like that gives you a little more leverage as you go into working with the legislature?
It does. I think that when many were measuring that in the 5 to 7% range, we could see it climbing into that last week or two of the race. And I think it's an honor, and it's a big, like I said, platter of opportunity. And I'll accept it humbly and try to engage everyone in my own party along with good ideas across the aisle and do what I've done for the last 6 years in the U.S. Senate. So these are real issues I just described. No one's got really the kind of magic solution to them. I'll just cite, again, like I have for many times when you try to justify why you should be leading the state, literally fixed health care 16 years ago in my own business from the user or demand side with no help other than listening to the insurance companies who were the ones that I was actually concerned about, and listened and did things like prevention and wellness. And I think that could be applicable across the state, and turning our own citizens into healthcare consumers. So that to me is thinking out of the box, different. And yes, I think that margin that we got and ended up with, which may have been one of the largest ever in an open seat gubernatorially. I don't know how far you go back, but at least to 1980. And I feel good about that.
Your transition team, you cast yourself as an outsider.
Yeah.
You know, this transition team is, you know, a platter of insiders in Indiana politics. How do you square that, and how is Micah Beckwith going to be involved in the transition?
So Micah came on board in a way that was kind of unexpected in terms of how he arrived there. He told me he was going to do that before he did it. I'd known him from the time when he brought his conservative leadership group out to D.C. because I spoke to them. And I always embrace competition and transparency. So I had no issue with his attempting to do it. He did it, and it's been a benefit in a way because it's kind of brought the party together. The part of the party that I think he represents is where all the passion is on the conservative side. And I think now they're on board, and it's my job to make sure that the full spectrum of what being a Republican is about in this state is then going to be focused on the kitchen table issues I've been talking about. I never, ever focus on the particular or the specific issue that you got to get through. I'm going to be always focused broadly, just like I was in building a business, or just like I did when I ran for Senate in that primary. And you're going to incorporate people that you know and others that you don't know in terms of their points of view. And here, I think whoever we have on the transition team will be people that understand that it's going to be my vision of being an entrepreneurial governor that's going to be conservative on the financial side, but very entrepreneurial on the problem fixing side. And when it comes to how I've run my business or my Senate office, it's going to be the same thing. And that's been the hardest thing for me to probably get buy-in from the general public, because it's unusual, number one, when you come from that pathway. But the transition team is going to be there to get us from one administration to the next. But what you ought to be paying attention to is what we do after we transition.
How's Beckwith going to be involved?
He's going to be involved in the same way he's been involved to date. He's going to have his own duties. It's going to be, revolving around being a lieutenant governor, and his input will be there for me to consider on any ideas or points of view he has. I'm going to clearly be setting the agenda, listening to all the folks that have helped me get here in the first place, and I'd be more focused on the results. And rather than questioning how that might pan out, just put a little attention to what has preceded me. That's the point that I've always found it difficult, because in the real world, you're judged by the results that you've produced. And in this world, it sometimes gets caught in the political crossfire. That is set aside. Now we're here about fixing things that need to be fixed, taking Indiana to a place I think that will distinguish it among the other 49 states.
The transition team
Go ahead.
includes several 3 weeks at Mitch Daniels' administration alums. Was that a deliberate choice, and is that a sign that you might try to pattern some of your approaches to how Daniels approached his administration?
Tell you what I'm going to pattern my approach after is the best of anything that's been part of the past. That's easy to see. I've just stressed that your record is important. And then I'm going to amalgamate that in to something that's going to be unique to the state. I've said all along, I'm going to be asking the audience, meaning every one of you, every constituent, all the folks that have an interest in making this state better. And if it's a good idea, I don't care where it comes from. I'm going to try to incorporate that into something that's unique, to where we actually tackle those issues we've talked about and do it in a way where many governors may not approach it. When you're wanting to reform health care, you think has anybody tried that in the past? No, because it's one of the biggest sectors of our economy. It's got political risk to it. I size up all that and I'll put a team together, and I think that is, if you want to pick the number one issue, it's the one that we have the worst results compared to most other states, measuring it down as finely as infant and maternal mortality. Those percentages are shameful. Our general health as a state and the cost of it, something that if we get that correct, that will singly be better than what we've probably done collectively over many generations of past governors.
Senator Braun, are there any
Yes.
current appointees, current figureheads within the Holcomb administration that you hope personally will stay on through the transition, will stay on into your administration?
That'll be very simple. I've had tips and cues for a long time from legislators that think this agency needs improvement, that one needs improvement, this one's running well, and get it from across the board, not just from the people I'm going to have to work with. That'll be the beauty of knowing what to do after you've done it for 37 years in a complicated, growing, sprawling enterprise. So yes, if there's an agency that's working well, just because it's been part of something else, you'd be silly to do something with it. But I'll look at each one critically, and it's not going to be hard for me and my team to discern whether it needs major overhaul, minor tune-up, or it's working well.
But any specific folks at this time? Or-
No, because I'm going to wait until we get in there and take a good look at it. I was focused on jumping the political hurdle, which we knew was going to be easier than what most people thought, but I take nothing for granted. I don't like to put the cart before the horse, and getting the transition done and what we're going to do once we hit the ground running, just keep up with the pace of it, because it's going to move methodically and quickly and in a way that I think is going to make sense to all of you.
On the topic of that, do you have concerns that some of these kitchen table issues that you've been talking
Yeah.
about, that you've campaigned on, could get overshadowed by some of the conversations that Attorney General Todd Rokita and Lieutenant Governor are talking about. They've really focused on some of those social issues. It seems like you've kind of stayed away from those. Are you concerned that those are going to your issues are going to get overshadowed by what they're saying?
No, because I'm going to get along with them. If I think that is getting off the rails, I'll discuss it. I've been clear, I've laid out 7 or 8 particular things. And to me, everyone's going to have an opinion on the issues that divide us. And the emphasis is that they divide us. You're probably not going to get much beyond that. Everyone should be interested in making sure that we spend our education dollars more effectively, or that we get health care done correctly. And I don't mind wrestling on any issue. I've done it on a much larger stage over the last 6 years and done a lot of it. So I feel comfortable in terms of how you get through that. I've had cranky employees before. I've had things that weren't working. Well, the way I generally solve that, I'd get the customer on the speakerphone, I'd bring the cranky salesman into my office, and we'd talk it out. And if you're good at kind of getting through that without having constant issues one after another, and you set the example and you stick with it, things work pretty well. It's a diverse group that you're going to be bringing in, and no one's going to be cut from the same cloth politically. I think I've made it pretty clear what I want to do in terms of the focus.
Reflecting on the last couple of
Yeah.
weeks, the campaign and party kind of went negative in TV advertisements and mailers. Is that, reflecting hindsight 2020, something you think was a good move?
Well, I think what that reflects is my opponent running a one-issue campaign negative from the get-go. And that is an approach you can take when you're up against it. I was generally talking about the things I want to do, just like we've talked about here today. And how you get through something politically, if you're taking an approach, you're going to have to counterpunch accordingly with an approach. And I think we balance that correctly. I think the reason I won by a record margin is I stuck on the theme I mentioned earlier. Listen, at this stage of the game, when you give up a Senate seat that would have been very easy politically to actually win that seat, it would have been by a much larger margin than I ended up winning the governor's seat by. That means you're doing something because you're really wanting to affect change, knowing that it was going to create a rowdy primary. Had that not occurred, I would have won by another 5 to 7 points. Again, that was brought on by my primary opponents. That's a political thing. You get through it. It's no different from after I won the primary, which was the uncertain journey because I didn't know much about it other than my gut feel and what I told you earlier, the analog between politics, government, and running a business. You then you're in the big leagues. You start off a point ahead of your opponent until they dump $30 million of negative advertising on you. Then you better either be able to shoulder it, plow through it, and that's the ebb and flow of running a campaign. Campaigns are way too expensive and way too negative. Everyone participates in the negativity, especially when you're not winning.
Senator Braun,
Yes.
has suggested that there be no exceptions to the state's near total abortion ban. Would your administration support a complete abortion ban in the state, no exceptions?
So that is an issue, too, that's been miscalculated by everyone listening to it. Number one, I hate to say anything absolutely, but let's look at the national level. That's a false narrative when you think you're going to do something that takes 60 senators that would have only occurred had the results been different from last night and the filibuster had been breached. So if you were talking about anything happening nationally, pro-life or pro-abortion, that was fake news because it was nearly impossible to happen. When you talk about what we do in our own state, I've been very clear. Our legislature fleshed out a law that reflects, I think, at least what half of Hoosiers are interested in. That, point of view is going to change over time as well. But I don't think there's going to be anything done on that issue because it's already been litigated. And I don't recall any rep or senator losing his or her job for being a part of it. Again, that was a critical error when you ran on one issue and you came out negatively to reinforce it. And I think that didn't resonate. And my difference was clearly, don't dismiss that as an issue, and you got to be attentive to it. But I think it was probably disingenuous and foolish to think that that was going to carry the day in a state that had just looked at it a couple years ago, and when you've got all the other issues I've just talked about.
Last week you mentioned that you would like, the state to be on par with Florida, Texas, Tennessee. What is it about those states that, is attractive to you that you want to see us?
To me, those are states that emphasize freedom and opportunity. And they are states that legislatively, I'm not necessarily saying we're going to emulate them, but they have the basic core that we get by with less government, and we run that government more efficiently. And for anyone that thinks that the plan from the other side of the aisle on the national level, that's generally enabled by 10 to 15 Republicans, is actually working, when you can't be smart enough to figure out how to spend less than you take in, and you're willing to borrow money from your kids and grandkids, that is a bad business plan. And the states that seem to at least get the fiscal component right and maybe stay on the kitchen table issues, they are going to be the successful ones. And I don't think that is currently being displayed by California, New York, even our neighbor to the west. That margin was the tightest it's been in a long time. The fact that Florida runs its government with more people for half the cost of New York's, that means people will vote with their feet eventually. I just want to pick out the practicality that's out there and do it as an entrepreneurial conservative, which means you're facing the issues, but you're doing it without borrowing money from future generations. And I'll be looking at all states, even if there's a blue state that's got a good solution on a particular problem. I will not ignore that, and I think it's always good to look at best practices that others might have and be practical in the pursuit of them.
Based on the slate of, I'm sorry, go up there.
Yeah.
Based on the slate of candidates that Hoosiers chose yesterday, do you think the GOP in Indiana is shifting in any kind of direction, a more conservative direction? I mean, what do you think it says about the Republican Party?
I think it says that not only in Indiana, but in some of the other places you've mentioned, it is a recognition that more should be done at the state level. Been clear about that because the other side, other point of view, has given us nothing more than massive deficits and debt, knocked nothing out of the park. And I think the places that are doubling down on that, they're going to keep having trouble in elections. Republicans have always been flat-footed on policy. I've been fleet-footed on policy. So I think what's going to get it right, especially at the state level, because you've got the guardrails in most places of a balanced budget amendment or a balanced budget statute. And if you don't, you run into your own issues. So I think it's going to be the combination of fiscal responsibility, which, by the way, most families, most businesses, almost all local governments actually live within, and then who gets it right entrepreneurially on fixing the issues that I've just talked about. So I think whatever's happening with our slate of candidates, it reflects Hoosiers' practicality on where we're going to actually take the state to keep the best of what we've got going and then address the issues I've talked about, especially healthcare, especially education, workforce, and we still haven't gotten that right. When I was there 10 years ago, we were stigmatizing against pathways that now, if you actually had the proper training and skills, You could have kids getting jobs right out of high school that pay more than most four-year degrees. They don't end up in the basement or looking for moving out of the state to find a job. And then underproducing STEM degrees, which pay the highest stratum of wages. We don't have enough of them. Getting that all balanced, I think, is going to be the element that makes any state work compared to other states. And I'm going to do it in a way that just cuts to the chase, finds the proper solutions, and hopefully get it legislated to where you put the framework in place to actually see things get better.
You mentioned several issues
Yeah.
throughout this. What specifically will you focus on in your first 90 days, your first legislative session? What specifically do you want to get done?
I'll be going through every agency, and that was addressed earlier, to make sure that the apparatus of government is working well. Over time, if you don't really, you got to remember, most governors have never signed the front side of a paycheck. You got to go back to, I think, Robert Orr in 1980 is the last one that comes from that background. Hardly any senator has. That's why, and they haven't taken Finance 101. That's why the place runs like that. So I'm going to probably spend my time there as we articulate the legislative agenda. And I was the first out on reforming property taxes. Hopefully that can be Senate Bill 1, House Bill 1, and do it in a way that builds on the platform I put out there. And I think we'll get that done. That has been by far the thing I've heard the most about over the last 2 years. And no one ever agrees with the fact that you should be growing taxes faster than the growth of your economy. And no one disagrees with the fact that we need to encourage home ownership, especially among young people and for older people to stay in their homes. So look at the apparatus, make sure it's running efficiently with people that are reflecting my vision, and then start rolling out the legislative side of things. And some of the things I'm talking about aren't going to be fixed in one session. If you start really trying to reform healthcare, well, they've been trying it for 6 years and they made a little headway. I got a bill introduced in the U.S. Senate that would be by far the most important piece of legislation that we've passed there in 2 decades, co-authored by a guy named Bernie Sanders. And you talk about something being tough, we wouldn't agree on anything other than got him to believe in competition and transparency. Generally, Democrats there just want more government regardless of what it costs. When I explained to him that if we could lower costs by the providers out there, it would cost Medicare and Medicaid less, started to see the head nod. Within a week, we crafted a bill that would have been way bigger on health care than Obamacare ever was, which was big government and big insurance, and has ended up in being mostly very costly, even though it has provided, which I believe in significantly, more access to health care, obviously covering pre-existing conditions. So there's plenty of stuff to get busy with. Go ahead.
Do you see any changes to this? Are you caught up on the pathways issue with the wait list for the waiver services for assisted living? Do you want to see any changes to that situation?
So that's obviously an area that caused a big distortion in the budget. And to me, we've already done some remediation towards it. I'll have to find out how Indiana, where you've got more people wanting to do that kind of managed care, but yet then you're involved with a program that's going broke at the federal level because they pay no attention to costs, and then you're cost sharing with them. That's got a particular issue that I think will stem the flow of any bleeding there, but it's got a much broader issue of how do we lower healthcare costs, which is hopefully something I'll be able to weigh in on. Back in the corner on your, have you had a, go ahead.
Yes. What are you going to be looking for as you start interviewing people for various appointed jobs in your administration?
Well, do you have the experience? Are you willing to reform if it needs to be reformed? Do you have ideas to where you're going to be kind of simpatico? And are you going to be a self-starter with energy that gets in there and actually starts doing the job. So that, again, is not going to be difficult. When you were running an organization, number one, it was so small and scrappy, you had to figure out how just to survive. And then over the last 20 years of the 37 years running Meyer Distributing, it became a sprawling enterprise with 90 some locations. So you had all these issues. And when you can do that, always making a profit, always growing a business, think about how easy that will be in a government where the revenues are given to you. And again, you don't have to compete with that. You just got to focus on how to run things well. Attracting talent and sizing them up will be something that most governors have not done before. I did that for a long time before I got into public service.
Do you see the duties of lieutenant governor shifting under Micah Beckwith? For example, Crouch really prioritized mental health. Do you see any changes to that office?
I'll make sure that the essentials of what you have to do as lieutenant governor are being done well. And if you're doing well with it and you can handle more load, I'll be looking at other places where you can deploy those skills. I'm not going to be fixed on the LG and being into a place where it's only doing what it's done historically. And I'll look to see what we accomplish through the things that you've got to do and see how that is handled. And I expect him to meet the challenge. And again, we're going to have a great team. I'm going to have a staff generally that's been with me through the whole Senate gig. How do you think you get the most legislation passed in any freshman Senate office? That's going to be easy. Here, when you're just looking at what the LG is going to do, that's a much more complicated dynamic. And hey, that's up to the individuals. They get with it. They are buying into what you want to do generally. And if they do well with it, you'd want them to do more. If they don't, well, then that means they're probably going to struggle with the basic duties they've got. I feel optimistic. He's been involved with the business. He's energetic. And if you stay focused on the issues, I think we'll do quite all right.
Earlier during this press conference, you
Yeah.
mentioned that you think a failure of messaging on the other side of the aisle,
Yeah.
that they focus too much on social issues, abortion specifically. Are there any social issues that you would like to take on or that you will entertain, or are you focused on what you've been discussing? 'Cause other states
I don't think there was one social issue in the 7 or 8 I mentioned. And that doesn't mean you're going to be oblivious to them or you're not going to be drawn into the fray. All I can tell you is that immediately creates division. And they change over time. Just look at some of the recent ones. A couple decades ago, it was this way. Now it's this way. So they are moving all the time. On the particular issue that she chose to focus on, I think that was a miscalculation. That doesn't mean that that won't change over time. For me, I've said very clearly, we addressed it. And the other issues I've mentioned is where my focus is going to be.
There are 4 Hope board members on your transition team. How are you, and obviously they helped you with policy proposals on the campaign trail. How are they working with you for the transition?
Well, I mean, they've helped me construct the policy that you need to put out there, that you run on and campaign on. That's all stuff that if I didn't like it, I would have weighed in on it. And I think that's a good indication. Remember, freedom and opportunity, kitchen table issues. And the one thing I'd love you to sense is that I'm in it to actually get some things done with a track record that I don't know how you could have more of it that shows that you know how to get from here to there. But I accept the fact that there's always going to be a side that's going to be counter-punching because they believe in a different approach philosophically. But sooner or later, it'd be nice to have a little reprieve to see if you can actually get stuff done where your record has shown that you can in difficult situations. So whoever's there, that is all part of how I wanted to craft the message of what you can look forward to.
Back on the legislative session coming up.
Yep.
We're already kind of hearing money is going to be tight for the budget. Are you keeping that in mind when you're thinking about your legislative priorities,
Well, that'd be coming from the typical perspective of you've got to have more to do more. I come from the world where I've always done more with the same or less. That's being effective and creative. The other paradigm is what the knuckleheads in DC have been doing for the last 4 to 5 decades. And all they've done is put us near in a technical bankruptcy and shouldered future generations with a mountain of debt. So I can't tell you how easy it is to make something run the same or better by actually doing 5% less in the resources. The problem is we hardly ever have had a governor that would focus on it that way. So don't assume that you got to have more to get more done. That doesn't mean in some areas you're not going to need to invest more to accomplish it. But that is something that I would say I've been most trained and fit for. And again, that was done with competition nipping at my flanks for 37 years, always being underestimated by them, always overperforming. And I think, again, we'll see some of that work here in our own state government. And I'm bringing on people that reflect that point of view. Actually, be creative, entrepreneurial, get more done with the same or less.
Senator Braun, throughout your campaign, you emphasized the need to expand school choice.
Yep.
And last night you talked about 60 to 70 counties in this state that have seen their populations, flatline or go down. How will you ensure that in the most rural communities, if you have one high school, say, right, you have limited options for these kids, how do you ensure that the most rural of rural Hoosiers have school choice? How is that logistically going to work, and who's going to?
The only way you turn that around without having to really force something to do it is you got to get those economies growing, because almost every one of them would be getting less because they have fewer students in the same size building and overhead. And a statistic that really surprised me is the average cost annually in a Hoosier classroom is about $245,000 per classroom. Teachers only getting even aspirationally $60,000 of that. That means we have put a lot of cost into administration, into buildings, and we've not been putting it into the classroom and the technique of how we educate. That has made our expense of education stay high, yet how we measure it is showing that it's not improving. So something's got to give. But to turn around the fact that 60 to 70 of our counties are losing population, therefore funding formula money, you got to get the economies growing. And that's when it comes back to the four corners of the state. Most of those rural counties are spread out across the state, and I spend a lot of time there. I happen to come from one that's defied those odds. Du Bois County and Jasper, they've almost doubled in population since I grew up there. You know why? Loaded with homegrown entrepreneurs. Never had one business from the outside come in. When it comes to economic development, fertilizing that field of small businesses, entrepreneurs, incentivizing some of the talent in these rural communities to come back and start their businesses there, rather than trying to fish in huge companies that use all your resources. Need to do a little of both, probably. But I think we've paid way too much attention on the few and the big. And I come from a place where we've been successful without any of those advantages.
When do you think we're going to start seeing some appointments, specifically the Secretary of Education, FSSA, et cetera?
So the election concluded last night. All I can tell you is I move fast. I'm used to it. I also know how to be patient when you need to be patient. So just expect that to all come out soon. I did put emphasis away from transition because I wanted to focus on jumping the hurdle to get the mandate. I don't think anyone raise your hand if you thought the mandate was going to come across the finish line like it did last night.
Did you?
I knew it'd be closer to that than what folks were trying to paint the thing as. So, and that's because of early. I had a strategy that was broad-based, kitchen table issues. People know where I've come from with strong leadership, proven track record. Sometimes you think, well, is that going to win? I knew it was going to win. I think the rest of the country, though, was fed up with what was trying to be sold here because it got put down across the board. And I'm not worried about Indiana and other enterprising states. I'm worried about what is my own party going to do with that opportunity now that they've caught the car politically. Are you going to be flat-footed? Are you going to be actually a fiscal conservative when you only talk about it? Let's see some results from there. I can tell you we're going to get results here, and I'm going to do my best to make sure it broadly benefits Hoosiers. Thanks for all your questions.
I think
Yeah.
we're